Alright, so I chose to do my presentation on the effect of microplastics on fish physiology. And rather than focusing in on one group of fish, it's sort of just on fish as a whole because it is an issue that affects all groups of fish. So, plastic pollution in general and plastic pollution is obviously an issue that we have because, it's everywhere. People just litter all the time and it ultimately feeds back and ends up having issues with wildlife. And so, rather than focusing on total pollution in the ocean, this is just going to focus in on the levels of microplastic pollution in the ocean. And so, microplastics make their way into the ocean in a couple ways. And the first is through domestic drainage systems, which are in our homes and obviously feed out into the ocean where they dump. And so, plastics get into these drainage systems, and I noticed in a lot of the research they discuss like toothbrushes and things along that lines, like household items that make their way out into the oceans. And then the second is through storm sewers. And these storm sewers feed out into the ocean, and similar to the domestic drainage system, things can get down in there, such as like plastic bags and things along that lines, and they make their way out into the ocean through there as well. And so it's been estimated that plastic actually makes up 80 to 85% of the total litter in the oceans, which is kind of astounding, but I guess when you really put it into perspective, which the amount of plastic that gets used each day in the US and across the world, that it's really not that crazy. And it's also been estimated that there will be more microplastics in the ocean than fish by 2050. And I'm not sure if that's an estimation of total pieces of microplastics or poundage or where they're getting that number from, but either way, it came across to me that it's showing that there's going to be a significant amount of plastic in the ocean. And since there already is, and it's going to continually to be so, that's an issue that needs to be addressed. So, just how does microplastic affect fish? Well, the fish can actually consume the microplastics through two main ways. And one is that for smaller fish, they typically mistake the microplastics for prey. And since their prey items are smaller, they will just consume these plastics and they'll just go straight into their digestional tract and cause a bunch of issues. Or they can eat prey with microplastics in them. And this is sometimes for the larger fish where they'll consume a smaller fish that already has these plastics in it. And when it digests the smaller fish, the microplastics make their way into its gut as well. And so I included this picture here that sort of shows how scientists have actually caught these fish and cut them and taken them apart and have just counted the amount of microplastic, which that's kind of crazy that this amount of plastic would be present in a fish this small. So you can just imagine how much more plastic is accumulating in the larger fish species. And so microplastics can lead to some issues in these fish and physiological changes. And so this study done in China shows where the microplastics were exposed to these fish for 30 or 60 days, depending on the group. But in both groups, they saw similar things. They noted that there was decreased growth and that the length and the weight of these fish were actually smaller after they had been exposed to the microplastics. They also noted histological changes in the liver, and these changes were actually noted as cytoplasmic vacuolation, which is where they like stain these liver cells with this dye and they don't appear to be dyed. So they appear as like a hole in the cytoplasm. And so they can be a variety of things, but one of the things that I saw that they sort of mentioned is that it could be like fat present in the liver, which is not ideal. And additionally, it's shown that there's altered expression of antioxidants and oxidative stress, which I included over here, where these antioxidants are no longer able to function, and it allows for more oxidation to take place in the body, which is sort of the oxidative stress that it's under. And so this study here actually goes along with what was previously on the other slide, and it sort of shows that these microplastics cause an increase in oxidation in the DNA base pairs. And so this was shown through this use of formimidopyrimidine glycosylase, or FPG, which is what I'm going to refer to it as because that's a mouthful. And this FPG was sort of used because it's able to break DNA after the oxidated bases. So in this figure here, it shows where there's the DNA breaks percentage on this y-axis, and there's the control and the microplastic exposure on the x. And you can see in the control group and in the microplastic group, with no FPG present, the same amount of DNA breakage was present. But you can see after there's been exposure to microplastics and FPG had been used, that the percentage of DNA strand breaks was way higher in the microplastic group than it was in the control group. And that's sort of signified by the A and B to show the significance. And this is an issue because increased oxidation can lead to issues such as cancer and other things in the cell of these fish because the integrity of the DNA is sort of lost after it's been oxidated so much. And so this obviously, like, it can happen in other things as well in the fish and leads to issues with it. So the major takeaways that you see here is that pollution is a major problem in our oceans and it's something that we need to figure out. And this plastic pollution does cause issues in the fish species, which is only going to get worse as the amount of plastic gets worse. And considering that it's something that is happening and happening more recently, there's been more studies being conducted on it each day to sort of figure out just how bad it is and how it really affects these fish. And so pollution's an issue that has to be addressed too because it affects us. And it's why I included this image here that shows the microplastics make their way into these fish, and then we as humans ultimately consume fish. And so I know that we clean fish and do things like that. Nobody's eating just a whole fish, but even if we don't consume the microplastics directly, the issues that happen in these fish, such as the oxidative bases, can ultimately feed back and affect us as well. And it means that it's a pretty important topic for everyone. And so this is just my literature cited page, and that basically